tell you a little bit about myself and why she had me come speak. I don't know if she shared me that you would have a guest. Did you even, do y'all know that you would have a guest at the conference? My background is in, Rivermont School. How many of you have gone to Rivermont School yet? Anybody? A couple of you? I did my undergraduate here at Liberty, and I was one of those students that, I don't know if this will be any of you, I graduated in January. Will any of you fit that category where, okay, it's going to be hard to find a full-time teaching job in January? And I was one of those students, and so I was filling out applications to substitute teach, and here in town was a opening for the Rivermont School. And so I went and interviewed, and I'd never seen anything like it. So if you've gone, you know a little bit what I'm talking about. But it was crazy. Up to that point, all of my schooling had been in Christian education. So this is like, Rivermont School are kids that are put out of the public school. So my mind was blown at the interview when they gave me a tour. And so now we're probably about into February when I had that interview. And I was like, there's no way, I'm not prepared to do that. I mean, Liberty didn't prepare me to work there. And at least that was my thinking. And so they called me back. They offered me the job. And I said no. I thought, you know, I'd get those substitute teaching calls. And that didn't happen right away. You kind of have to be called and do it a couple times. And so they called me back again. They still had it open and asked me to reconsider. And they said they'd pay me for the summer if I'd come in March. So here I am, 21. You know, if I work March, April, May, they're going to pay me to come teach June, July, August. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it. And who wouldn't hire me after being at Rivermont School for a semester? You know, I looked so good on my resume. And so it's funny how God just will send you on a completely different path than you ever thought you would do, because my degree was elementary education. And then at my time at Rivermont School, I just started getting burdened with, I guess, the least of these. Why haven't I ever been exposed to this before? How did I not know in all my years of Christian education that this is taking place right here in our communities and down 2 miles down our road? And it just kind of opened me up to another whole world. And so I stayed at Rivermont School for 10 years, and I got really burdened and passionate with why aren't we doing more in Christian ed for special ed. And so my mom is actually the dean of the School of Ed. She was at the time too. And so I was talking with her about why don't we have a special ed program. And so with my mom, we started the special ed program, and I was teaching night classes at Rivermont School here with 6 students. This is about 10 years ago now. And and it's just so neat to think, because a job I didn't want, so you all remember this when you're out there interviewing, a job I didn't want, Liberty has a special ed program that now has about 1,000 students. So God just laid something in my heart, and that's been my life all along. You know, I never wanted to come back to Liberty to teach either. No offense, but the first year I had to come back, they were still doing skirts, and I was like, I haven't had to do this. I've been in the other world for 10 years, and there was no way I was going to buy all new skirts and come back to Liberty and have a thumb on me again. So I told God no to that too, and here I am. The special ed program is my baby, so when people come and ask me to come talk, I love to do it. Now I'm the Associate Dean of the online programs, and I deal with, I miss you guys so much because I deal with Dear President Falwell emails. I am concerned about it. So I really miss teaching sometimes. I was just actually saying to somebody the other day how I wish I could come back to teaching sometimes. Anyway, with all that, that's why I get invited to speak. So I'm going to start with prayer. Anything we need to be praying about that you all want to, I know I'm a guest, so you may not want to share things you've been praying about. All right, let me pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to share the things you've laid on my heart over the years. Be with this class. Help us to have a great time of learning about kids and adolescents with emotional behavior problems. And just help us to have a wonderful time together. And we ask this in your son's name. Amen. All right, so I was asked to speak on this topic specifically. Have you guys covered this much yet? Characteristics of EBD? Okay. Anybody know this might be the population they want to work with, or most of, okay, good, a couple of you. Or some of you like, oh, anyone but the EBD population? You could have been it. Because I was that, remember? I didn't want this job. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what that means. When you get jobs in the schools, you're going to hear different terminologies for it. Some people refer to it as EBD, but most of the school systems call it ED, because IDEA calls it ED, emotional disabilities. But what it is not is any of these combinations. You'll hear emotional disorder, social disorder, behavioral disorder, emotionally maladjustment, emotional disturbance, emotionally handicapped, behavioral impairment. You'll hear some of these different combinations. But the most common is EBD, emotional behavioral disabilities, okay? And then hopefully you've gotten this beat into your head that you always put the person before the disability. Yes? This is very important. This came out while I was teaching, and I remember thinking this is that politically correct mumbo jumbo stuff. And I remember being annoyed by it. But I'll never forget, I was having an eligibility meeting, and this is the meeting where a parent finds out what their child's disability is. And we had to tell a mom that her child is mentally handicapped, but at the time you said retarded. And I remember, like, you couldn't, like, all of a sudden, everything I learned in the classes made sense, because I'm looking at a parent and telling her that their kid is mentally retarded. And so that then was an epiphany for me on why we talk the way we talk. I mean, imagine sitting in a meeting and hearing people talk about your child. You'll get so used to doing IEP meetings, one after another, that you're going to forget that there's parents in the room who are hearing some of this for the first time. Or that you're saying EBD, like it's a textbook case, that is their son that you're saying has an emotional behavior disability. So that's why we're really careful about the language that we use when we talk to people. And so it's a hard habit to get into. You've probably gotten points off on your papers, and it's hard to really adjust to that language, so we try to make it a habit for you. So you don't, it's not an EBD kid, it's students with emotional behavior disabilities. Okay. All right. There's problems with the definition. IDEA and APA don't always completely match. So IDEA, the law you've learned so much about, is the ED. They actually don't use EBD. I don't believe that's changed. But Counsel for Children with the Behavior Disorders, they're a division of CEC. CCBD is a division of CEC. Don't you love our alphabet soup and special education? But they like EBD because they worry about taking the behavior out of ED. It's not just an emotional disability, it's emotional behavior disability. And they have a very specific reason for that, and it's this one down here. For some reason, the definition, and we'll talk about that, you can have the EBD label with these XYZ things, except it will say conduct disorders. It'll actually say conduct disorders, pervasive developmental disorders, autism, and traumatic brain injury. So you can meet all the qualifications. Now, autism and traumatic brain, TBI, that makes sense, right? Because that should be the primary label. You don't need an EBD label if you have autism. Where it doesn't make sense to this group is conduct disorders. Why would you rule out conduct disorders if someone needs an IEP? And the reason they do this, and this is what upsets some of the groups, is so that they can kick students out. Have you learned yet about FBAs and BIPs? MDRs? Oh, y'all, what year, y'all? This is fun. What, sophomore? Okay. MDR, you'll learn more of this later, and it gets complicated, but it's interesting now because it's the controversy, is a manifestation determination review. Does this sound familiar? No? What class is this? Current trends? Is it?
This is the first one. Yeah.
Oh, it's the first one. Okay. All right, well, cool. MDR, Manifestation Determination Review, is something in IDEA, MDR, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that determines whether or not a child can be kicked out of school because of their disability. This is actually in the law, okay? Because the law says a child with a disability has to get education, right? We've learned that much. So the least restrictive environment, free and appropriate public education, LRE, FAPE, you hear all the alphabet soup? It's overwhelming, isn't it? LRE, FAPE, all right? So that is required. But what about the bad kids? Now what? Because there's also a federal law that has zero tolerance. So you all are probably familiar with the zero tolerance law. It's just from being a high school student. So when they search the lockers, when there's a weapon in the school, you're out, boom, period, right? But what about those kids that need help but have drugs? You follow that? This is very controversial in this field because a lot of schools want to kick them out because these kids can be expensive. Rivermont School costs, okay, the average kid in Lynchburg to go to school is $6,000, okay? That's your tax-paying money. It's about $6,000 a year to educate a kid. Rivermont schools, the starting fee is $40,000. If there's an aide, it goes up to about $55,000. If Rivermont school is too much and they go to a place like Bridges Treatment Center, are you familiar with that place? I mean, they have special ed teachers as well. That is about $400,000 a year, okay? Now, when budgets are tight and money is thin, it becomes a controversy of, is this a conduct disorder or is this EBD? All right? And this gets really complicated. I'll probably hit this again later at the end if we have time. But that's why there's some disagreement in conduct disorders, APA and IDEA 2004, okay? Schools want the power to put these kids out of school, all right? Now, just so you know, my bias, and we all have them, I'm with the CCBD group, because if a kid needs help, a kid needs help. Now, it makes sense, you brought a gun to school, you're kicked out, you don't deserve education. Is education a right or a privilege, right? I get that, that's what we tend to think. Is it a right or a privilege? Now, he's your neighbor. He's your neighbor, he brought a gun to school, he's very disturbed, and now he's getting nothing. He's your neighbor. Now you want him to have something, right? Now you want him to, he needs a treatment center, he needs to be in a detention home, he needs to get some kind of help. He's sitting in his house with nothing to do after he brought a gun to school. So that's our mentality, those that think conduct disorders should go with EBD and why they want B to stay in the EBD. Did you follow that? Okay, it's very complicated. Another very controversial one, though we've gotten better with this, and I'm going to pick on Christian schools a little bit here. Anybody from the Christian school background? Oh wow, a lot of you, okay. They tend to really, and I'm overgeneralizing, but those are just the bad kids. The rotten apple spoils the bunch. Those are the types of things you'll sometimes hear. It's just sin. And if the parents would just whoop them, that kind of mentality. And I think we can get lost, and I'll talk more about this later, in the fact that there are people who genuinely need help, and lots of different kinds of help, and probably need Christian school more than anybody else, right? Because we believe in the least of these. But we'll get caught in it's the sin and they need a kick in the tail, okay? And so it's a problem in some of our circles that we don't know how to handle EBD. It's really hard for, and I'm picking on Christian schools, churches do the same thing, to see this as a disability. We don't see it as a disability. We're most notorious for calling it sin or a disturbance or poor parenting. And so actually recognizing the definition in the disability is a struggle in our circles. We've come a long way with that. In my day, for example, medication was you don't medicate people. I don't know, I think that's probably changed a lot, yes? You don't hear the controversy about medication? Do you all remember the controversy about medication? Any of you kind of, you need the Holy Spirit, not drugs for depression, that kind of thing? Okay. But that's gotten better. I think we've taken a more holistic view, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit too. But this has been a serious problem as I've, another neat thing I've done, and I don't mean to sound because remember everything I say in the context that I didn't want to do this, okay? But now I also travel to Christian schools and I speak on this topic, and I've seen the change over the decade. That's amazing. It used to be that they wouldn't let me talk about it a certain way, or I had to beg to come. I heard about your school, please let me come and talk to your teachers, because I hear that you're kicking a lot of students out, that kind of thing. But then now I'm invited, and they're open. And there's a very big need shift in Christian education. There weren't special ed teachers in Christian schools back 15, 20 years ago. They didn't exist, but they're there now. So it's a really neat time. But the interesting thing is EBD is still the hardest one for them. They would rather deal with autism, learning disabilities, even mental handicaps, but the behavior problems, it scares them. Okay, the one rotten apple spoils the bunch. That's the mentality. Okay. So anyway, those are some big controversial things that surround this topic. All right. All right. So how do they get identified? Do you all know about identification, eligibility? There's 4 major assessments that take place. Yes? Are you familiar with this? You have your psychological. It's your ability, intelligence. Your psychological is your IQ, essentially. Okay. You have your educational achievement and teacher reports, so what kind of grades do they get? How do they do in content? Okay? Then you have your medical reports, and that's the doctors. These are all very important. And then you have your social reports, so what's happening at home and what's happening in the school. Everyone is important, but here's the hard thing with EBD. How do you identify it? I mean, you can't, like with mental handicaps, I'm going to come back. I can get this to you guys, by the way, so if you're frantic about notes, I'll make sure you get my presentation. If you go, y'all are familiar with the bell curve, yes? Okay, for mental retardation, which is now mentally handicapped, mental impairment, you can actually identify it on a psychological, on a test. It's right here. You see it's a little purple. It's the lower percentage, right? You can identify gifted. Actually, you can even identify learning disabilities on these tests if you haven't learned that yet. And when you read a psychological test, which you all won't do, you're not school psychologists, you will do the educational, but a school psychologist will do the test. It will say something like scattering ability or discrepancies in subscores. Because a learning disability will go like this, boom, 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 and all the subscores, right? You'll see 2 standard deviations between a subscore. You can see it. You can look at a test, see learning disability. You can look at a test and see mental handicaps. How do you see emotional behavior problems? And that is one of the problems we have with this disability. How do you measure it? How do I pinpoint it and say, yes, this kid is EBD, and it's not a conduct disorder? So you have to rule everything else out is the first step. And you'd be amazed at what you rule out. I remember my student teaching experience before I even knew about this whole world of EBD. I was at Sandusky, which was one of the prime schools to have in my day. I mean, those were good kids. I was at Sandusky. It was a 2nd grade class. I was with a teacher that was about ready to retire. I mean, she was in her 70s. And I remember my first couple days with her thinking that something seemed like she seemed out of touch. Because we do things like practicing walking down the hallway, practicing sitting at our desks, practicing sharpening our pencils. She seemed so militant and old school, but I learned later she was phenomenal, and she was setting the standards for the class. But at the time, I was kind of prejudging her, like she's just ready to retire. So in that time I'm prejudging her, she noticed right away a student, which happened to be an African-American male, so I remember I'm judging her as that teacher who's out of touch, was too hyper. And so she put him through eligibility, and I remember thinking, she just doesn't understand kids today. He's not a hyper kid, he's just a boy. I knew it all. I was 21, I knew it all, right? She puts him through eligibility. We go to the eligibility meeting and look at all the documentations. And the reason I was so against her doing it is this kid was getting all A's. He was a smart kid, a sweet kid. I just couldn't understand why she was doing it. He seemed very hyper, and she wondered about ADHD. So we do all the tests, and we look at the medical report, and this kid was almost legally blind. He couldn't see, so what looked like hyperactivity was him doing this. And he was just reading, and he was all over the class doing it, like just reading things. And after the meeting, he ended up coming back to class with those big Coca-Cola bottom glasses. I mean, they were those where his eyes looked huge, you know. And so she was right. I mean, she'd been teaching for so many years, she recognized something was off with this kid. And so I always tell people, you'll hear it. You'll get this a lot because everybody's going to think you're an expert once you're a special ed teacher. You'll hear it from everybody. Should I test my kids? The school wants to label my child. You'll hear this. You'll hear it all the time. And I always say, this is about $2,000 worth of testing. If they want to do that for your kid, take it. And then you can look and see what's going on. And actually, parents have more rights than any other parent if your kid has special ed needs, because then you have an IP meeting, you can dictate their education, and all those things. So all that to say, you're doing this for EBD to rule out a lot of other things. Another thing, by the way, ADHD only comes from this. A lot of people don't realize that. The only person who can give the ADHD label is a medical doctor, okay? It won't come from psychological or educational or social reports, all right? Whew. I'm a fast talker. All right, so with all that, you've collected the tests. Here is how you identify someone with EBD. You have to have all these characteristics. All 3 of these have to be in place. Very important. 1, it has to affect school. And that opens the door for a lot of issues. Okay? So you have to be plugged in and noticing your students. Is this affecting their school? Okay? 2, over 6 months, This accounts for temporary crisis. So if a family is getting divorced and a kid starts acting out, if there's a death in the family, one we're seeing a lot right now are deployments. And so an interesting that's happening with military deployments is they're getting multiple deployments and they're going over 6 months. So now we have a son who's acting out because his dad keeps getting deployed, but it's over 6 months. So is this an EBD, or is he going through a temporary crisis that keeps not being temporary? So you can almost just study military kids in the current climate, and that in and of itself is an interesting study. All right, so all three, and everyone's so important. This one's so important because that rules out if it's an oil vinegar problem. So say that we just have it out for each other. Something about us, we just don't get along. And we're just going to always have problems in class. And that's sad, but it's out there. So the more than one setting rules out that. So it needs to be happening anywhere else, in the home, on the bus, in the cafeteria. It has to be happening somewhere else to rule out that setting, okay? So affecting school over 6 months, more than one setting. So that helps you kind of narrow down the EBD, all right? Another big issue with EBD that can be very challenging is external and internal types of EBD. And this, I think, greatly affects prevalence. And by prevalence, I mean who's getting the label. When I was teaching, all of my students at Rivermont School were African American males. This is the subject where I hate that I'm being recorded. She's recording me in front of the class because I want to be frank. We over-identify African American males, and so there's a prevalence problem with the EBD label. And there's all kinds of controversy about this. As a matter of fact, it was in the paper, I think about 2-3 weeks ago. You can look it up. This isn't just EBD, but it's behavioral issues. It was in the paper that Lynchburg City schools are suspending the African American population. It looked like about twice the rate of the white students. Okay, so we have an issue with this, and people are debating the issues, and it's very controversial. And you all are the generation that's finally talking about it, because I was the generation where it just happened, and you didn't really discuss it. And so now we're talking about it. But how do you talk about it? And it's very awkward. I believe, and this is just from my experience of 10 years at Rivermont School, that this problem is because of this issue right here. Externalizing and internalizing emotions. So think first boy, girl. Girls are likely to have emotional behavior problems that are quiet, right? So they're more likely to have an eating disorder. And I did at one point in our school, we had a female student who was in and out of hospitals. They gave her the EBD label for an eating disorder so she could have the therapy at our school, because we had a full-time licensed professional counselor at the school. She would get down to 80 pounds and get hospitalized. And it was actually very interesting, because we put her in with, and she's in a class with the other type of conduct behavior disorder problems. And so they would tease her about being too skinny and stuff, which actually was kind of good for her. It was really kind of interesting. But I hate that I'm being recorded. Y'all are going to get the good stories. But anyway, you probably could read all between the lines there. But it was kind of funny having her in the class with the other type of conduct issues when hers was the eating disorder. So you think of girls, and you're more likely to have the depression, the eating disorders. The cutting behaviors was something that was happening when I was teaching. And so what are those? Those are internalized, right? So teachers don't see them, and they don't realize it's impacting school. Boys are more likely to be external. They're more likely to get caught, or they're more likely to throw a chair, or they're more likely to say blankety blank blank to the teacher. So now you tend to have an over-identification of males over females, because that's what a teacher sees. You see what's external. And then I think the same thing happens culturally. And so if you really want to, as a teacher, understand an African American culture, that if you're in, especially the South, I would encourage you to go to a black church. Go to a black church, see how they worship. See how, or if you really have a neat opportunity to go to a black funeral. I was really shocked to see a good friend of mine, the funeral lasted 6 days. And it amazes me. Other major organizations know this. It should belong right there. So a pastor, right? You believe that God designed us a certain way, and He gave us our certain crosses to bear. right? We probably all believe that, and at least a little bit, whether we believe it a lot. If we believed it a lot, we'd be a pastor. Although you are mostly women, so you can't do that, right? Anyway, so spiritual. So which one is the most important? They all are. And as far as treatment goes, to treat the whole child, they're all equally important, okay? You have to believe in the child then. How does that make you feel? How does that hurt when I look at you like that as a teacher, when I give you the stink eye? How does that make you feel when you already feel inadequate, when you're already cutting, right? That would be the child within. Do they need medication or maybe caffeine? Actually, caffeine is a stimulant. So it's the same as Ritalin. A lot of people don't realize that. So if you're one of those adults where you can't function without your coffee or Mountain Dew, like really, like your mind doesn't work, you might be ADHD. Little tidbit for you. But anyway, what does the child need organically, right? And then teachers, we believe in this already. Is this a safe place for them to be? Are they going into a safe place in the evenings? That's the environment. How do I get them to do what I need them to do? That's the reinforcements and the stickers and the prizes and all those things. And then spiritual. You know what's so fascinating? We've taken that out of schools. We've taken that out of treatment for EBD, but all the other major treatment groups still use it, like Alcoholics Anonymous, NA, SA, all of them. It's the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity. It's their foundational belief and treatment for Alcoholics Anonymous is spiritual. Think about that. I mean, that's powerful, but we don't have that in our public schools, which is none of the reason I get on a soapbox about Christian schools doing this. Because we will never treat the whole child with EBD if we don't treat spiritual. And we know that true to our faith. It will never be fixed. We will just keep putting Band-Aid on Band-Aid on Band-Aid on Band-Aid. They'll keep bleeding through the Band-Aids until we can deal with spiritual. Because it's so powerful. And AA knows that. Redemption, forgiveness, confession. It's all part of treatment for all the other major issues. But we don't do it in the treatment for kids with EBD. And until they could go to a place of redemption with whatever brokenness they're coming to you with, you are putting on Band-Aids, okay? And so, you'll see, I'm going to show this, there's the whole, they fall between the cracks. Your communities, because of this treatment, right, often will argue over these kids and what kind of treatment they should have. So, is this a juvenile delinquent problem? Is it a court issue? And then there's their budget. Is it a mental health issue? And then there's the mental health budget. And is this an education issue? Is this a school problem? And then you have your school budget. And so people fight over these kids, they fall through the cracks, and none of them get help. And where do they end up if you're EBD? Prison. Prison. They go to prison. We have no system for dealing with this in America. It really is somewhat of a mess, okay? And it's not anything new. I love musicals, and one of my favorites is West Side Story, and I wonder if this is going to work, actually. There's the song, Officer Krumke. Does that sound familiar? Let's see if this works. Already not working. Do we have any experts in here with knowledge?
Was cooking up something to dance tonight, so don't think he's gonna put nothing over on me. Hey, son.
So this is what we just talked about.
Now go on, get a move on, all these. And don't let me catch none of these around here when I get back.
See you around now, huh?
Can you see it? So it's the worst label you can have in our society. There is no worse label or predictor for success in America. If you have you're better off with a mental retardation, or mental impairment label than you are with emotional disabilities. If you have an EBD label more than any other population in America, you're more likely to end up in prison, you're more likely to end up dead, you're more likely to end up an addict, you're more likely to end up a single parent, murdered or a murderer. All the statistics for America, this is the worst label you can have. And so think about that. Think of how huge that is. And I honestly believe, and when I talk like this, I don't mean to sound self-righteous, because remember, I didn't want to do it, but I honestly believe you don't get more least of these in America than EBD. That is the most disenfranchised population in America. And so you saw a picture of why there's a problem. And people are trying to fix it. So for example, in Virginia, they've taken all these different budgets. So you have your mental health budget, you have your social worker budget, you have your juvenile delinquent budget, you have your school budget. All of those folks have a budget. And in Virginia, and all your states have something similar to this. In Virginia, they've taken from everybody's budget and they've put it over here in this pot, just for the reason you just saw from Officer Krupke. And in Virginia, it's called CSA funds, Community Services Act funds. And it's for students or children or adolescents that are at risk of leaving the community due to their behavior issues. At risk of leaving the community. So at risk of detention home, at risk of leaving their family to foster care, to the treatment centers. And that is where the Rivermont School money comes from. It's where the treatment center money comes from. It's where foster care money comes from. In Virginia, it comes from this big pool of money called CSA. And it's this whole other funding stream. And it's been powerful. And some people believe it actually helps kids. But here's the thing. It stops at adult. The funds no longer exist for adults. So if you are having a mental handicap, so the old MR label, there are group homes for you. There are halfway houses for you. There's foster care for you, even as an adult. There is adult care. EBD, it's gone. So if you don't fix somehow that problem and that cross God gave you to bear for your entire life, because we've come to learn, I think, haven't we, that we don't necessarily lose our struggles. We battle them forever, right? If you don't lose it, which we don't, right? You don't lose your draw to anger. You don't necessarily lose your draw to depression. It's something that will be part of your life, probably, and part of the cross that you bear for all your life, although none of you are probably in the category I'm talking about because they're at risk of leaving the community. But in America, at age 21, it's gone. You're on your own, right? And it's a really tough situation because it's the cost of freedom, and that's the flip side of it. And so if you go back before we have the laws that we currently have, that's where you have those movies like The Birds Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest type of movies. I mean, they would just say, you're EBD, you're going over here in this hospital with a white jacket, and now we don't have to worry about you killing your family, okay? So in America, not having anything for EBD is the cost of freedom, and it's purely our court system, and that's why they end up in prison. You follow that? Or homeless. I mean, there's a lot of statistics that people living on the streets, wherever you go, are EBD. They have the EBD label, okay? Another thing really powerful about the treatment and you as teachers is EBD has nothing to do with psychological disorders. Follow that. This is very complicated. I've been saying those. I've been saying depression and eating disorders and all those. But you don't get to know that as a teacher. All you know as a teacher is their EBD. The psychological disorder is in the DSM-4, or I think it's a 5 now. It's 5. DSM-5, if you ever want to just do something kind of interesting at sometime when you're at Barnes & Noble, go look at the DSM-5 book. It is this big, full of all the things that could be mentally wrong with you. I mean, and I'm not kidding, it is crazy. It's full of, post-traumatic stress disorder, ADD, reactive attachment disorders. I mean, on and on. I mean, it's just full of disorders, okay? That has nothing to do with EBD. DSM, I think it's Diagnostic Statistic Measurements, is that right? Manual, Diagnostic Statistic Manual, very good. Did y'all learn about that in a psych class, or I'm curious if you two are drawn toward the child within because you've been in that. Do you want to be counselors? Have you thought about it? Yeah, okay.
But I do really like this,
Yeah.
psychological side.
Do you talk like this? I'm just teasing. You could be a counselor and be a behaviorist, by the way. That's Dr. Phil. So you could still be a behaviorist, and that whole how's it working for you? He's not the, how'd that make you feel? Okay, do you see that? He's still a behaviorist, but a counselor, which is very important. I actually am a behaviorist, so I love him, but I'm drawn to being a behaviorist. To a fault, because remember, all of it is important. But I would have run-ins. I eventually became a principal at the Rivermont School, and we had therapists on staff, and I would have run-ins with them constantly. They would give me you know, what you just did, how do you think you made the kid feel when you made that decision? I'm like, I don't care how you feel, they just cursed out a teacher. You go deal with that, you know. So that's two behaviors, you know. So anyway, it's just interesting. But I could do that because we had a therapist on staff. Does that make sense? Like, that's your job. You let me do my job, you know. All right, anyway, so, but here's where it also gets crazy and why we have so many problems with this population. All these things have to be taking place in society, community, school, and home. You guys get school 6 hours a day for 180 days a year. 365 days for 24 hours. I mean, you see how you're going uphill constantly? I remember at Rivermont School, when things like winter break happened, when they came back from Christmas, you felt like you were starting all over again. Because for 24 hours, for 2 weeks, they dealt with awful things. And now I'm right back to the drawing board. For some of our students, it was every Monday, because they went home on the weekends. Or it was Dad's weekend. We had a couple kids that we had to physically escort into their house because they refused to go home. They had a cab and 2 men that rode in the back that took them home and walked them to the front door because they refused to go home. How do you help that kid? And I could tell you endless story. I remember one thing that I thought was, you know, again, just picture all my education, Christian schools, and I'm coming to save the world in the least of these, right? I was so self-righteous and arrogant. I can't even begin to tell you some of that story that God took me through my spiritual journey. But one of the things my first year as teacher I demanded I had to do was give them a birthday cake, right? And so many of them never had a birthday cake. I'll never forget the first time I did it. I put the cake in front of them, the class is singing. He threw the cake off the table and ran out of the room. It was my first time. And so later I'm talking to him, what happened? It was your birthday. I'd never had a cake before. 8-year-old. I've never had a birthday cake before. Like, your mind can't even grapple with that, can it? I mean, I remember just thinking, this is insane. Well, and another time that happened, the kid went under the desk and started crying on his birthday. They don't even know what to do. No one's ever given a birthday cake and saying happy birthday. And so how do you, like, where do you begin? Like, where do you help these folks, you know? And the one crying under the desk actually said that he got whipped the night before. And he had switch marks down his back. We had to call social services. The night before his birthday, he had switch marks down his back. Endless stories. So anyway, here's what they look like in your class. What you will see in the assessments that you give is intelligence and achievement don't match. Something is off. You'll just see a weird puzzle. As a matter of fact, most of the time on the psychological, if you're dealing with the Rivermont School type extreme EBD, the psychological report would read like this. The student refused to take the test. I tried every 15 minutes. At one point, he broke his pencil. He tore up the paper. That's actually, for our kids, that's what a psychological report would read like. They would pretty much tell her, blankety blank, I'm not doing this test. And because they're stressful. Any of you have done a psychological? At first they're fun, so they'll try it. It's like, put this puzzle together. They're how do you think type things. So it's not 2 + 2 = 4. That's education. Psychologicals are intelligence, so it's match these pictures that go together, and it frustrates them because it's abstract. And abstract thinking is very frustrating. Where they might think, so if they really sell it, if you have a good psychological giving in that test, they'll make it fun, they'll take a lot of breaks, and they'll make the sale. But you almost never got an accurate report on their psychological or intellectual. So you'll see weird things like that. We've talked about the internal and external. And then it's not TBI, autism, or conduct disorders. Okay, they have ruled those out of EBD. Just so you're, that goes on a timer. Just so you're aware, if I'm scaring some of you, you don't have to have EBD kids in your class. I hope that some of you feel that calling towards it and you're not being too scared. But these are the range of services. Hospital is the most severe. Homebound, which is a really neat thing some of you might want to do for extra money. I was a homebound teacher, but they're kids who are too severe for a school, so you go into their homes and teach, or I actually, with EBD, probably want to go somewhere like social services and teach, or the library and teach. I've tried to do it in the homes with some of these kids, and I can tell you some really interesting home stories. It's very distracting, but And so, but the least restrictive being consulting services. So they just see a counselor once a week, like the guidance counselor at the school. But it goes for all these. And you all know you say general, not regular, right? Because regular implies that special ed is irregular, right? Okay. So general class with resource. This population is more self-contained than any other population, though, because they're disruptive. But this is very important for you to understand this. They can never be in self-contained because they're disruptive. Listen very carefully. This is one of those tricks you want to know. It's a trick of the trade, okay? They can never be in self-contained because they're disruptive. That is not LRE, least restrictive environment. They can't be because they're disruptive. What it would be is, Johnny can't meet his or his goals in my general ed class. His behavior is too severe for him to be able to participate in math. It's not because he's disruptive. Did you follow the difference? An individualized education plan is individualized around Johnny, not your math class. So if Johnny is too severe to be in your class, it is about his goals not being met. It is not about your math class being disturbed by Johnny. So many teachers will get this wrong, and then they don't get kids the help they need because they're so stuck on. And this is more of a general ed teacher problem than a special ed teacher problem. This is another neat thing about our callings, by the way. Are you all doing special ed, or some of you dual? Okay, about half and half. General ed, good. I'm speaking to some general ed people. General ed people, by your calling, you typically love teaching and a content. Isn't that neat? God laid something on your heart. You love teaching and a content. Special ed teachers, we tend to see Johnny. We see an individual. We don't see the math class. And it's one of the reasons we don't communicate well. I don't know if anybody's talked to you about that, but collaboration between general and special ed is a huge problem because we're speaking in different languages. And we shouldn't do that. So I'm speaking to her about, but that's what Johnny needs. And she's sitting there saying, but I can't get to my math lesson. So do you hear how we don't communicate, all right? But I need to be able to say, Johnny, math class to her, and she needs to be able to say to me, Johnny isn't getting his needs met. You hear the difference? If she talks to me about Johnny, now we're on the same language. If I talk to her about her math class, now I'm off the language. But anyway, it's another neat thing about our callings. Isn't that neat? When God lays something on your heart, and some of you might even be thinking, maybe I am special ed, or maybe I am general ed. You know. But anyway, so you have all these services that you can use in the IEP, but it is always based on the individual for the IEP. Okay? What does that kid need to get their needs met? And a lot of times I'll see we play with these kids. So when I was at Rivermont School, what I mean by that, it's the Officer Krumke thing again. They'd come to my middle school and they'd have a file this thick because teachers with the best of intentions were trying, I guess, or maybe they didn't want to spend the money on Rivermont School. I don't know what it is. But you send me a kid, a 13-year-old, with a file this thick, I've got 5 years before he's going to drop out of school to fix that. And so I prefer, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, early intervention. So we shouldn't play games. We should get all the help we can, and right away, right when the school sees a problem, you need early intervention. Right away. And so there's a lot of things in the homes that you can do. You can put a behavior specialist in a home with a family. Any of you interested in those preschool ages? That is real. You could really step in and help these families. Another thing, if y'all are looking for something to do for Christian services that I thought was so cool, I did this for a little while after I left Rivermont School, I think a little soon for me. I'm glad because I wasn't burnt out. I don't know if you have any professors that were burnt out because that's like, you don't want to hear from them. Because you want that passion, right? But anyway, I was very happy I left when I still loved the kids. But because of that, I missed them. And so I did something called CASA Volunteer. This is really neat, but it's another way to do early intervention. Court-appointed special advocate. And what they do is they're looking for volunteers to walk beside kids when a child abuse report is made. So it's pretty much at the beginning. So someone calls social services, and your job is to be a voice for the kids. I've had 2 cases, and they were fascinating, but it's very focused on early intervention. One of my kids, I'll go ahead and share it a little bit because it's just so neat in a way, but the oldest was 9 to the baby, it was 4 kids. And then the mom was an addict and was losing her children to being an addict. And it was heartbreaking because you could see she loved her kids and couldn't beat the addiction, because she would show up to court every time we had a court appointment, dressed nice with her Bible, but you could kind of still tell like her hair was out of place, that sort of thing. She always failed the test. All she had to do was come to court and pass a test to get her kids back. And she'd come looking the part, and I remember just sitting there thinking, let this be the time she gets her kids back, because she loved her kids. She never passed the test the whole time I was there. But it was 4 kids, 3 fathers from 4 kids. I had about 3 sets of maternal, grandparents, 1 set of maternal, obviously, 3 set of grandparents, and 2 aunts and uncles that all were filing petition for the different sets of kids. And I was a voice for the kids. Think of how powerful it is. I mean, it was really a neat opportunity. So something to think about if you want to get some experience in early intervention. I'll just go ahead and tell, because I know you don't know the stories, but so you had to get to know the kids and figure out what they wanted, and I guess, and I had some experience because I'd been at Rivermont School for 10 years, but the 9-year-old neat kid, you could tell he took on the dad role at age 9. But every time I asked him when we talked about it, keep us together, keep us together, keep us together. Isn't that neat? 9 years old, keep us together. I don't care, keep us together. So anyway, but 2 of the fathers, by the way, were in prison filing a petition because they didn't want to pay child support when they got out. But they were in prison. But anyway, there was 1 grandparent group who were church going. So I mean, I didn't say that in my report, but it was definitely, that showed some stability in my opinion. But they were church going that could take 3 and not the baby, and they were maternal, which I thought was important to the mom's parents, because the mom still wanted her kids back. And an aunt lived half a mile away that would take the baby, so it was the closest together I could get them. But it was a really neat, and part of the contract was how often they get the baby with the kids. CASA, court-appointed special advocate, and all your communities have them.
How, like, for a student with ED, how do they get, or how are they eligible for early intervention if you have to go through all those hoops to get it before, like, rather than 4 years old?
This type of stuff. So this was court-appointed. They weren't even, actually none of these kids were EBD. They seemed pretty regular. But had someone not stepped in, and not me, I'm not even saying me, but whoever, actually it was a teacher, by the way, that called. She testified in court. I watched a teacher testify against this mother. They were absent a few days in a row, and she made a home visit, and the mother was passed out, and the boy was drying their clothes on a kerosene heater. I mean, it was one of those stories you could have read in the paper where 4 kids died in a fire, had a teacher not made a home visit and filed a report. So that's how it happens early, if you follow that. So then now we were able to come in and save these kids and get them in a stable environment. And so that's why I even mentioned CASA, because it won't happen. Once you did the EBD label, you're right, it's no longer early intervention. They've already gotten to predictor through a rough life. So how do we get them before the rough life? And when I remember when I said it's all of them, I'll paint this picture. My mom used to tease, and it's funny, I don't think you really get some of this till you have kids. And my kids, I didn't have until after I left Rivermont School. And my two children are so innately different. It is the most unbelievable thing. But my mom used to tell this story of being pregnant, and my older sister was the wild child, the black sheep of the family kind of thing, always getting into trouble. She said in the womb, she was always just squiggling and warming, and she jokes that one time my mom was sitting in the choir singing, and my sister kicked her Bible off her lap. She jokes that she knew then, And then she got pregnant with me, and at the time I was very timid, shy. And Rivermont School actually got me out of that. I was like that all the way to Rivermont School. When I did my first lesson plan in front of my second grade class, well, here, I'll take it back to this. My speech class here at Liberty, I left every one of those in tears because I was that shy. And so whenever God uses me for stuff like this, I still get like sweaty nose. But it's funny that He does. But anyway, God's strength in our weakness, right? But anyway, back to being pregnant, my mom being pregnant, and when she was pregnant with me, she thought I was going to be stillborn. She actually went a few times to check to make sure I was still having a heartbeat, because I was so quiet in her womb, right? Now, spiritually, we know some of this to be true, too. Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Is that interesting? But my sister was put in a Christian home whose 2 parents were Christian educators, and she's now a Christian teacher and doing great. and she still battles life because she was innately born to battle life, where I just constantly step in the, I mean, it's ridiculous even. It's ridiculous. I have my doctorate degree, it's ridiculous. I can just, and we love each other, but we laugh at each other, like how I just constantly step into my path and she constantly steps into her path. But it was in the womb, spiritual battle, but she was placed in an environment with two loving parents that sent her on the right path. Okay, so now take this back to a problem child in a home with no dad, so they're just innately rebellious, where the mom doesn't know what to do, so they whoop them, to the point where, and this is my foster son, I had a foster son for 2.5 years, to the point where she can't take care of this one child any longer, so she puts him in foster care. And in foster care, he was abused in 8 different homes because they didn't know how to handle him. He goes to Bridges, the treatment center, where we go pick him up. And I'll never forget, I've had him for about 2 weeks, and we're at Burger King here in town, and he leans over to me. He's a 13-year-old boy, big boy too, so it was always weird when we were out because I felt like they looked like we were on a date because he's like tall. 13-year-old big boy, broad shoulders. He leans over to me. I think that's my mom right there. And Burger King getting ready to take our order. I'm like, should we leave? He's like, I don't know what to do. She looks up. She hadn't seen him in 7 years and says, is that you, Daryl? Is that you, Daryl? And she starts screaming and crying. She comes from around the back, comes to the front, hugging him, pulls out her wallet, has an old picture of him when he was 5, and said, I just couldn't handle you. I couldn't handle you. She kept the other 4 kids. I couldn't handle you. You were affecting the other 4 kids. And so this is his life, okay? A kid with rebellious nature born into this family without any support. So if people can come in early, that's the picture I'm painting, and somehow get help. More Christian families need to do foster care. We had a foster daughter too, sexually abused in most of her homes. Let that register. Foster parents. We need more people doing the least of these and doing it early. Okay? So that's early intervention. Integrative services is recognizing who can help this kid. So is it the social worker? Is it, sometimes it is the courts. I don't want to act like prison is the dead end. Sometimes you have that kid where they need to go eat with the pigs, right? They need prison for a little while. They just are rebellious to a point where nothing else is going to get their attention, right? So is it that? Often it isn't that, though, because they'll go to detention home where they meet people who sell drugs. They hadn't even started selling drugs yet, but now they met the other greatest predictor of BD, a dad-like figure who will have them sell drugs, right? So anyway, I could go on and on, but what is it? What is the piece of the puzzle? What is the integrated services? And every kid will have a different answer for that. One of the most powerful tools I'd seen in my experience were aunts and grandmas, because they love that sister or daughter that couldn't raise this kid, and that's still their nephew or grandson, and they'll step in. But who is it? Who is the integrated services? Transition, okay? So they have the worst predictor for transitioning anywhere. This is generalization. Have you learned about this in your lesson plans yet? Generalization? So you might learn how to behave in my class, and we finally, after 2 years, have established a good rapport. Can you take that into the hallway and say yes, ma'am, to the person you pass there? And they often can't. They can't transition into other areas, and so then we lose them in transition. That is why I think at Rivermont schools we had so many middle school students, because think of what happens at middle school. You know, you have puberty, which is one thing, but then you have that 1 or 2 teachers they had to the hallway with 6 teachers, and we didn't prepare them transition. We didn't prepare them for someone to bump into them in the hallway while they're at their locker. So someone does it, and they turn around and do the blankety blank blank, and they flip out and throw things, and they end up at Rivermont school. Okay, so every transition from teacher to recess to middle school to life, every transition for EBD is so critical, and that then involves the collaborating with these 2 populations. All this has to go together. Collect data to determine if the treatment matches the problem. We're not going to spend a lot of time on treatment in this session, but the biggest thing you need to know is pay attention to why they're acting out. That's where you need a therapist. For example, if I'm doing this because of attention seeking, or because because, I'm not getting attention from my dad, and so here's a male teacher, and so I'm going to act out because now I'm getting attention from a male, then you need to figure out how to treat that instead of reinforce the negative. So then what you would do is you create a contract where you get my attention if you do these good things. But when you do these bad things, you lose my attention, all right? So for EBD, you kind of have to figure out the puzzle, but you do that in collaboration with your integrative services. So that's when the therapist lets you know, this is this issue and that's this issue, and here's the treatment. For example, if a kid has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of a situation that happened with a male, when they're in crisis, I wouldn't want to call them in. But that's what we do, isn't it? When a student's in crisis, we call them in to come help because we want the strong arms. Well, the PTSD is around the male. So now I'm reinforcing their PTSD and I'm keeping them stuck in a cycle, okay? So with EBD, this is what you always want to remember. Am I treating the problem or am I reinforcing the problem, okay? For example, detention home, integrative services. I had one kid, if I threatened to call his probation officer, he would say, 2 hots and a cot. In other words, I'm going to get my meals. Call them. He liked the detention home. So I was reinforcing his behavior by calling the probation officer. Did you see that? Or another one we'd see a lot of, I'll never forget this one. I had a kid, he was this cute little kid, which by the way, the little ones are a little more scary to me than the bigger ones because they don't know how to withdraw. So in other words, when they're angry, they just wail, like almost like girl fights, like just the wailing, the scratching, the pulling the hair. Where an older one is angry, they've learned some, usually most of them, they've learned a little bit to hold back. For example, I'll never forget, these 2 big boys were getting ready to fight to the point where if I'm holding them back, my hand's on their chest up here. That's how big they were. And I'm like, you would never do this, by the way, but I knew these boys, and I knew this is what would happen. So I got between them, was like, you all need to calm down right now. My hand's on their chest. And then the one's leaning over my hand, you're lucky she's holding me back. I'm like, yeah, I'm holding this big kid back with my one hand, like Superwoman. But they know how to hold back. But the little ones, I thought you just stapler for a little one because just stapler coming, because they don't know how to hold back. But anyway, I had one of those kids. 5-year-old boy, couldn't hold back, and he was just wailing at me. And so I had a little fat lip. I've only been there for about a month. I had a little fat lip from a 5-year-old. So we called him home, suspended him. He came back from the suspension with teeth missing and a fat lip. So all that to say that treatment helped the problem. So you had to deal with at Rivermont School whether or not to call certain parents. And then you had to deal with students who didn't understand that. Well, I can't suspend this kid, because if I suspend this kid, he'll come back and lift. So those are the types of constant questions you have to ask yourself. All right. Now, this is what we had talked about with, let's see, punishment versus reinforcements. That's the teaching again. By the way, with these kids, you don't want to use punishment if at all possible. You want to keep it positive. Because they already know. They've got the EBD label. They know they're a problem. The family knows they're a problem. So you want to think of how to positively reinforce good behavior as much as possible. We've learned this naturally. It's called the internalized locus of control. You all remember this in some psych classes? We've naturally learned that because we had parents that said, good job, I'm so proud of you. You're in higher education. If you are in higher education, you have an internalized locus of control. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. All right? So we sometimes can't relate to people that don't. So we're trying to rebuild that in older kids. When we learned it when we were 2. Good job. I'm proud of you. Thank you. They didn't get that. So how do you rebuild that? And you do that with reinforcements, positive reinforcements. Okay? And this is the MDR stuff I told you about. Hopefully you'll learn a lot more about this. MDR, manifestation determination review. And then you do a functional assessment to determine if their disability cause was a causal factor of the suspension. All right, so here's the law for MDR. You can't have more than 10 days of suspension if you have a disability. That's the law. It's an IPEA. You can't have more than 10 days suspension. So then you do an MDR to determine if the disability could be a causal factor. But here's the thing. If the label is EBD, it probably is always a causal factor, right? But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the child is blind, right? Did they know they were bringing drugs to school because they're blind? Now you could see you might not have a causal factor. Maybe they didn't know they were picking up drugs. Who knows, right? Maybe they didn't know it was a bag of marijuana because they couldn't see it. But chances are, if they're selling drugs and they're blind, the blindness isn't a causal factor, right? But if it's EBD, it's probably always a causal factor. But some schools will argue this, though, because they don't want to provide the treatment and funds for the kids. Okay? I have been in meetings where they have said, but you didn't say in the present level of performance, the plot, that he had trouble with authority. And since you didn't write that, I don't think it's a causal factor. And I'm sitting there thinking, he's EBD. Of course he has trouble with authority. I had to say that, you know. But that's what those meetings look like. So it's MDR. And to get the data, you do what's called an FBA. It used to be called FAs in my day, but now they call it Functional Behavioral Assessment, where you collect data, and then you write a behavior intervention plan. And the entire behavior intervention plan is focused on treatment matching the problem. So I was actually, when this first came out, I was pretty annoyed about it, because it was more paperwork. This is almost like doing another whole IEP meeting. It's just paperwork. And I'll never forget the first time I had to do one. It was on a boy, we'll call him Anthony, and Anthony was on his 9th suspension. And so by law, I had to conduct an MDR to determine if his suspensions were part of his disability. And so we did that. And then we did the functional assessment. And when we collected our data, we realized Anthony was always getting suspended during PE, during competitive play, and with this one particular other student. They were getting in a fight during PE. But as a principal, I didn't notice that was happening because I've been dealing with 9 suspensions over the period of 5 months. So then I realized we were reinforcing a problem for this kid. He didn't. So for his plan then, we took away competitive play. So for PE, they did things where there weren't winners and losers. And we observed once we realized what was happening. And we saw we had one of those male PE teachers that kind of instigated some of the problems. That I'm going to whip you, who's going to win today, in your face. And you know, from the outside looking in, you're thinking this isn't a good idea for kids with EBD, right? In your face, you know. So he was instigating the problem. So we told him to tone it down a notch, stop the competitiveness with this kid, right? And then we never let those 2 kids be opposite of each other. We made them team, like they work together. Not competitive work together, but team work together, so team play. We stopped having suspensions, at least during PE, because he was a kid with EBD. We didn't fix it, but we made it better, okay? That is what this is about, all right? So we step back and look at the problem and fix it. Concerns with the media, this is a very real concern if you ever work with the EBD population, because they tend to lose sense of reality. That's part of the psychological problems. And so they don't understand things like, I could give endless examples of this. I had a kid who was real into wrestling. And he didn't understand that you can't pick up the chair and throw it at people. Like that could send someone to the hospital. And he really couldn't get that. I had 2 kids who hated each other so bad. I mean, it was so bad. We eventually had to kick them out of Rivermont School, which is pretty bad. And whenever I would conference with them in my office, all they could ever tell me, it was like Ja Rule and 50 Cent. This probably dates me. But that's all they could ever tell me. It was 2 rappers that hated each other, so we hate each other too. And it made no sense. I mean the level of hate where it was all out fights, going into each other's neighborhood and beating up each other's siblings. I mean, all out hate because of 2 rappers. I mean, they weren't even part of a gang. It was that copycat mentality. But they had lost a sense of reality, okay? And so with our students, you need to be I would even say you need to know their media. Know their media, know their medium. That's all changed now from my day, because social media wasn't what it was when I was a teacher. So it would probably even be social media. But know their songs. And I tell you, some of the best conversations I've had with students is discussing this. I'll never remember once you sitting down and telling a kid, I know what those lyrics about and what they say about women, and it explains why you talk to me the way you do. And we had a really good conversation about that. So you need to know their reality, because their media is their reality. So where some kids can play Grand Theft Auto 2, or it's probably on 5 now, where some kids, if it's even still around, some kids can do that. Other kids lose sense of reality with it. and there's a disrespect to police officers is real. It's not pretend. It's not something on the movies. It's real. Okay? And then response to intervention. You all should be pretty familiar with that, yes? And that's, where does this fit with that? And it's the same. So you try things in the general classroom. All that's the same. My worry with RTI is similar to what you said about getting them help soon enough. Because we play too long with these kids. With these kids, you need to come in and give crisis wrap-around intervention services as soon as possible. And so I really do worry RTI is going to keep some of that from happening. I think this might be my last slide. Oh, some little tips. I cover this when I come speak to student teachers. So, this is on a timer, it's driving me crazy. I was asked once to speak. When I first came to Liberty, my passion was that we didn't have a behavior management class, and we still really don't. So feel free to write that up in your alumni surveys, because it's such a pet peeve of mine. But anyway, so then we decided to make student teaching of behavior management similar while you're student teaching. But I think we maybe cover that in 2 sessions. I don't know, but it's still not where I would think I would like it to be. But I was asked once to come speak to a KDP group on behavior management in a half hour. And so I scribbled this out. This is probably almost 15 years or so ago now. I scribbled this out and did it for the KDP group. And it kind of took off, which is kind of neat. So it's now a little guidebook